During the 60 years after the fall of the temple, the Romans and their Jewish subjects lived in an uneasy truce. Many Jews moved to the fertile area around the Sea of Galilee to try and rebuild their lives. But there were some for whom the rebuilding only brought on painful memories of the building they longed to reconstruct most, the temple. In 130 AD, anger at the Roman Emperor Hadrian for refusing to allow the rebuilding of the temple reached the boiling point. Rumors of a new revolt began to spread.
Many Jews continued to consider Roman presence in the land of Israel to be illegitimate. This was the evil empire it had no business being. Clearly, however, there must have been immediate stimuli to this war, and we're not sure what they were. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, it was Hadrian's attempt at building a pagan city in Jerusalem to be called Aelia Capitolina that threw, as it were, the Jews over the edge and into the abyss of military uprising. Another Roman source claims that it was an attempt by Hadrian to prohibit circumcision of Jewish children. We cannot know, but that would have been, at the very most, it would have been the final push into what must have been a popular resentment of Rome that needed some sort of stimulation.
The rebellion began among a band of outlaws living in the countryside. Their leader was called Simon Bar Kokhba. The Romans had long considered Bar Kokhba merely a thief. But to many of his fellow Jews, he was another in a long line of freedom fighters who had refused to accept Roman rule.
Bar Kokhba was a Jew like the Zealots, like the defenders of Masada, who was willing to take up arms against Roman occupation and was willing to fight for Jewish sovereignty and, in fact, for a limited period of time, achieved sovereignty. We can hold in our hands the coinage that Bar Kokhba issued in his own kingdom, the last kingdom of Jewish sovereignty for another 2,000 years.
Rather than confront the mighty Roman legions from a great city like Jerusalem, as in the last uprising, Bar Kokhba came up with a plan for a guerrilla war. A Roman historian described Bar Kokhba's preparation for the revolt.
They occupied caves in the countryside and strengthened them in order that they might have places of refuge whenever they should be hard-pressed. And they pierced subterranean passages from above at intervals to let in air and light.
As plans for a rebellion began to leak out, rumors raced through the region that Bar Kokhba was the messianic leader foretold in the Bible, who would lead the Jewish people to freedom.
His name meant star, and he claimed to be a luminary who had come down to them from heaven and was magically enlightening those who were in misery.
Simeon Bar Kokhba, as we now know his name to have really been, is called Bar Kokhba, son of a star, because there was a prophecy in the Bible that spoke of a star as a symbolic name for a messianic figure. Now this fellow Bar Kokhba was a tremendous military leader who between 132 to 5 almost kicked the Romans out of Judea, and in fact caused many, many Roman soldiers to be killed in the prolonged battles of the revolt that he had brought into being. But the key point to realize is that the Bar Kokhba revolt was a messianic revolt in which people entered into the revolt believing firmly that the Messiah would come if they would be victorious.
Bar Kokhba's charismatic leadership appealed to not just peasants and craftsmen, but also scholars and sages. Their fervor was stoked by certain prophecies in the Bible, which they believed said this was the precise moment in history God had chosen for the temple to be rebuilt.
Just as the first temple at one point lay in ruins and was rebuilt, so too will the second temple. And they were, in their minds, God's agents. They were going to defeat the Romans. And the third temple was going to descend from the sky like a prefab, completely built right on that same spot. And that was, in a sense, its messianic mission, that they were doing God's will to throw off the evil empire. That's what God wanted.
In 132 AD, the most prominent rabbi in Judea publicly declared that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah. The ranks of the rebels swelled even more. With hundreds of thousands now ready to follow him, Bar Kokhba nevertheless remained patient. In order to lull Hadrian and his legions into a false sense of security, he counseled his followers to pretend to be happy and peaceful.
So long indeed as Hadrian was close by in Egypt, the Jews remained quiet. Except that they made the weapons which the Romans demanded of them as tribute of such poor quality that the Romans rejected them. By this ruse, they were able to have use of these weapons themselves.
In a strategic masterstroke, Bar Kokhba bided his time until Hadrian was well on his way back to Rome. Then, suddenly, he launched the revolt. In the early days of the rebellion, the rebels inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on the Romans.
In the ancient world, Jews were not known as bookish and prayerful and pious. They were known as ruthless and ferocious fighters. They were highly prized as mercenary soldiers, and they showed in the uprising against Rome exactly how effective they were on the field of battle.
The stunning success of the rebels forced the Romans to withdraw from the region. Bar Kokhba then declared Judea to be an independent kingdom. But the Romans were merely waiting to counterattack until they had assembled one of the greatest armies in their history. They had sent 3 legions against Jerusalem in the rebellion 60 years earlier. Now they sent 13.
Hadrian sent against the Jews his best general, Julius Severus, who was dispatched from Britain. Hadrian ordered him to put to the sword all who stood in their path.
Rome responds to Bar Kokhba by throwing masses of its military force into the fray. Legions would be brought in not only from Judea, from Egypt, from the surrounding countries, but as far as across the Danube River. A commander would be brought in from Britain. There was absolutely no way that Hadrian could allow even partial success to this uprising.
Severus did not venture to attack his opponents in the open, in view of their numbers and their desperation. Instead, he isolated them in small groups. They dispensed with the rebels who were hiding in their caves by filling them with smoke and guarding the exits. Then they surprised and killed all who came out to fight. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles. And the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and suffocation was past finding out.
With the rebellion crushed, the people of Judea faced even worse retribution from the Romans than after the uprising 60 years earlier. For the Romans now set themselves the goal of wiping the Jews from Judea.
The Bar Kokhba rebellion was known really as the most disastrous single event that ever happened to the Jewish people before the Holocaust. In fact, when we look at the three literary accounts, we find that they all agree. Nearly 600,000 Jews were killed. Over 900 Jewish villages were destroyed. And for one small moment in Jewish history, again, it looked like Jewish history might have been over.
In the aftermath of the uprising, the Romans changed the name of the region from Judea to Palestine. Then they banned all Jews from Jerusalem.
The emperor then commanded by legal decree that the whole nation of the Jews should be forcibly removed from the district round Jerusalem, so that not even from a distance could they see their ancestral home. Thus the city came to be bereft of the nation of the Jews, and in honor of the emperor alias Hadrian, the name of the city became Aelia.
The outcome of the Bar Kokhba revolt is a much more serious policy on the part of the Romans, prohibiting Jews from even going to Jerusalem, and they plow over the Temple Mount and build a temple to their gods on that spot, thereby showing you have no place here, we clearly are the winners.
In the centuries that followed, whole villages of Jews began to leave Judea in search of a new life. They headed for the Jewish communities that had been flourishing for centuries in Babylon, in Greece, in Rome, and many other places. But in their new homes, they would soon face a challenge to their survival every bit as daunting as the Romans.